welcome back for those people who were here last quarter, and welcome to those who are new. Um, I'm really delighted to start this winter quarter with today's talk. And the last quarter, we looked at the overarching art history. And this quarter, we're going more specific. And today's talk is going to be more specific about women artists in the 20th century. The reason we've created the curriculum this way is that, and also focusing on women artists, some of us who were in art history, say 20, 30, 40 years ago when we were taking art history, hardly people were talking about women artists. I mean, the past 10 years, of course, it's been just the major thing, but somehow it was not discussed. And I think it's time to just look at the whole overview of it. And I'm very delighted to have Jennie Braman to do that. I met Jennie when she was doing her master's degree at the Arts and Consciousness department. She got her MFA. And so I met her there, but I didn't know that she got her bachelor in art history, and her concentration was actually women's studies at the Williams College in Massachusetts. So I didn't know that about Jennie, so I was just delighted to hear that. So when I heard that background, so of course, I thought that she would be really a great candidate for us to look at the overarching. She's been a full-time faculty since she graduated in the studio arts and art history at Berkeley City College in Berkeley. I'm really delighted to have Jennie here. She also was part of our artist residency program, so she was there. And one of the things that you will see is a little different with this program than other programs is that I like to invite artists to talk about art history, because artists have a particular viewpoint in art history. Art historians have their own view, but I like to see artists talk about art history. And last quarter we had, I talked about Lucid art. We had Mike Grady give a lecture, and also Jeremy Morgan. And everybody is an artist talking about art history. And there's something else that comes through when you have an artist looking at the history of art. So I'm really delighted to have you here, Jennie, talking about women artists in the 20th century, and I will hand it to you. And then I'll come back again when we are doing a Q&A. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Fariba. And thank you so much for inviting me to do this. And also thank you to the support of the Lucid Art Foundation. I'm really excited to share these amazing lives, actually, of women. So let's get started. Okay. So my talk today is called Seeds of the Unconscious, Pattern and Insight of 20th Century Women Artists. And Fariba, I think your introduction is perfect because really the sort of the topic that I'm going to be covering today has really emerged from sort of my work in the world as an educator, specifically teaching women in art history for many years, and also as an artist. So as I have been teaching, I have been noticing over and over again that many of the artists I was kind of introducing to my students were using a small mark, something simple, something like in this Ruth Asawa drawing. Now, this particular drawing has actually really inspired me year after year, in fact. And I think I always come back to the simplicity of the triangle, especially right over here. We can see about a third of the way across some really simple line work. And then I sort of, as we do, as we research other artists and things like that, I've been noticing that more and more of the artists, the women artists specifically, who really come into their own in terms of exhibitions and in terms of helping us rewrite the history of Western art, end up creating these massive installations. And often they are based on what I'm going to call the seed mark. So this drawing, I think, is a really good example of taking a very basic, simple element, and then the way that, at least in this small drawing, Ruth Asawa continues to magnify, amplify, change, etc., to a very interesting degree. Also, as a woman, mother, educator, I was looking a lot, especially over the last 2 years during the pandemic with a little extra time, at the sort of life stories of artists, and really, really honestly looking for models for me as a woman in the world, for people, like a model of how to live, how to give everything that I want to give to my community. And I think sadly in the history of Western art, we see so many, we almost have this sort of myth, right, of the isolated artist, often male, often self-destructive, or of women artists who have had to sacrifice so much in order to get acknowledged, sometimes even sacrificing, key and important aspects of their identity. So in this talk, I'm going to also be sort of putting forth artists who model a new paradigm that we can embrace as 21st century viewers, artists, and art historians alike. Finally, as an artist, I also make images, in fact, like this in ink. And I also have a seed mark. And I haven't thought about it that way until I've kind of done this research, but I often engage in repetitive mark making. And what I would notice as I was sort of doing these marks is that inevitably I would start off with a particular mark, and then I would continue, I would get very into it, and then I would shift. There was an impulse for me to diverge, an impulse towards variation. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And it's consistent. I don't know if it's because I'm impatient or what, but I thought that that was a really interesting element to watch in my own self as an artist. And then also to find a correlation in these artists that I so admire and revere. So this talk is really looking at artists who use this small unit, and I'm going to call this a seed mark, and through repetition build a visual field, a threshold of accumulation. And here we have another untitled drawing by Ruth Asawa. And you can see, even just at first glance, right, this was made actually with a little stamp back when she was at Black Mountain College. But the stamp itself, right, is repeated, and yet there's a great deal of variation in tone and in sort of how that mark corresponds to the negative space. So I'm going to use this term threshold and really use the definitions to outline the talk today. I have been fascinated with this word threshold for a long time. I use it to understand in a lot of ways what I do in my own work. And I think it can be really informative here. So I'm going to actually talk about the definitions here, but I also wanted to highlight the artists that I'm going to be talking about. The first one in the upper right is Shirazeh Houshiary, but in where she's kind of made her home in London, England, most people pronounce her name Houshiary. So I'll be following along in that suit. So we have Shirazeh Houshiary, we have Alma Thomas, we have Agnes Martin on the lower right, we have Nene Okore on the upper left, and we have Ruth Asawa. So going back to the definitions of threshold. One, thinking about a gate or a door. We're going to be looking at their artwork today as objects, the sort of result of their labor, thinking about how we as their viewers feel in it and around it. And I'm going to really, kind of propose that their work operates as doors in several different contexts. Two, thinking about the point at which a physiological or psychological effect begins to happen. and or begins to be produced. So here I really want to think about the result of their work, right? Not just as an object, but the sort of way that the object influences us as we experience it, and then as we sort of take that experience out into the world. 3, thinking about the work as an end, or specifically a boundary. And I want to think about their work today as a boundary between the ordinary world and the extraordinary, or the non-ordinary world, between the concrete and the abstract. And when I sort of bring up this duality between the ordinary and the non-ordinary, I immediately think of shamans, who, like artists, have traditionally inhabited that sort of marginal space between what is accepted, what is not accepted for artists, often what is the cultural norm, what will be the cultural norm, past and future, but also really thinking in terms of shamanic activity, how we experience the world as a concrete reality, and then moving into perhaps even a different way of thinking about ourselves and our world in this like a non-ordinary state. So I'm going to also argue that these artists who I've just introduced to you all will be kind of functioning as shamans in our contemporary 21st century, because of this ability for them to actually make a doorway through which we enter and experience ourselves in new ways. So 4, thinking about a threshold as the place or point of entering or beginning. And I love the example that the dictionary puts here, like the outset on the threshold of a new age. And for me, as Fariba mentioned, this is an important time in art history, and an important time in terms of culture making, and really sort of thinking about the different ways that we are making new stories, right? And really even understanding the past stories about art and its interaction with society, and the makers that really have been forerunners, and who have helped us reflect on who we are in the modern age. So just to actually go back also one slide, I have chosen each of these slides for these artists who to me also feel like they're on the threshold. I love that image of Houshiary sitting on the sill, literally, of her studio, looking into her studio, as we will as well, looking into her process. Alma Thomas here, standing between her work and her sort of samples and creative combinations, and us as the photographer or the viewer. Okore, she's literally actually ensconced in her work, standing slightly behind it. We are meeting her at the threshold of her creative process. Agnes Martin, standing kind of like Thomas, between us and her canvases, in a chair that I think is an important part of her creative process. And finally, looking at Ruth Asawa, standing in front of the door that she carved, that were the front doors of her home in San Francisco. So the last definition to look at as threshold is a level, point, or value above which something is true or will take place, and below which it is not or will not. Immediately, I'm thinking about glass ceilings, which several of the artists today will be breaking through. I've chosen to highlight the 5 women artists, and 4 women are women of color, and have all really broken through a lot of the limitations imposed on them by cultural biases. So for this idea of the threshold, I think that one thing that keeps coming up when I look at these artists is how all of them are very interested in the plasticity of perception, right? And sort of thinking about who are we? What line do we cross to understand the nature of the self, and the nature and construction of our world? All of these artists have been interested in and avid readers of philosophy, physics, literature, music, etc., and informed by deep observation of our universe. So, and there are some other emerging patterns among them. First, the seed mark, Artists use a seed mark, which when repeated creates a threshold of accumulation. And this seed mark, and I think this is really interesting, will stay the same size, small, even though the work increasingly becomes large as a total work, right? Or as a totality. Number two, all are inspired by nature or processes of the natural, sort of fundamental ways that they experience the world, not only watching nature, but also sort of thinking about it symbolically and metaphorically. So themes of light, growth, birth, and decay will emerge over and over again. Three, all make large body engulfing works that from the works all make large body engulfing works that require extreme endurance and patience. And even in this extreme endurance and huge amount of time that they put in to make the work, they are all seeking physical embodiments for us as the viewer, right? And for them as the maker of joy, vitality, and transience, which I just want to point out is something that we don't often hear, right? As we think about culture and we think about artists and the sort of myths that we have inherited, we don't often hear people talk about the joy of making and the joy that they want others to experience from their work. Number four, sorry, my number five. Oh, no, I'm sorry. My numbers got confused, but I'm going to speak now to number three here, union of opposites. All speak of their work as a union of opposites, or that in their work they straddle dualities. And the dualities that come forward are order and chaos, birth, death, existence, non-existence, and form and formlessness. Number five, community. All contribute greatly to their community as educators, mothers, activists, and writers, in addition to producing large-scale exhibitions of their work. And six, all of them use language that transcend social divisions, such as nationality, race, and culture. Houshiary said in 2000, quote, "I set out to capture my breath, to find the essence of my own existence, transcending name, nationality, and culture." So I wanted to start off with the questions that I asked of these artists, and so that you can also ask these questions as we move through our presentation. First, what is the seed mark? How do we identify the sort of smallest unit that will be repeated? In this case, this is a detail from Alma Thomas's Red Rose Cantata. You can see that the seed mark is a single sort of dab of the brush, and it looks like it was made rather quickly. You can see some areas that are a little bit thicker, some areas a little bit thinner, and that in some places there's a very sort of consistent verticality in the kind of mark, and then in other places there's something else that happens. So thinking about how that seed mark is made, and what is the vehicle of consistency, right? This is, again, like from an artist perspective, what about their process helps them to be consistent? I think that's a really interesting question. How do you continue to make the same mark, right? As a human body, we are so subject to change and variation. And it takes actually a lot of work to create something that is consistent. So how do they do that? Second, in that second bullet point, what is the vehicle of this consistency? So are they going to make, is it the paintbrush? Is it a particular size of their canvas? Is it a particular way that they move, etc.? And then third, what kind of structure does that create? So what kind of order results from this level of consistency? And finally, thinking about that last point, what is the vehicle of variation? Where does the impulse to change emerge? When? How? Why? And how, right, is that sort of that seed mark when it moves from a vertical dab of a brush to a more sort of horizontal dab? how is that in dialogue with the original seed mark? So, other questions? The first one, and what is the rate of frequency for the seed mark? So this gets into something that I think is quite exciting, right? When we talk about frequency, we're really talking about how often a particular simple element is repeated within a given frame or space. I'm actually going to, as many artists and art thinkers, cultural producers, et cetera, do, make some interesting parallels and borrow language from musical compositions in order to talk about repetition in the visual field. So when you see a very simple mark, like in the first line of this musical notation, we see, and our brain actually wants to lump repeated simple notes together. So our brain will actually settle on the first one in the left, right here, and then as we find the pattern of a similar repeated element, we jump right from one to one, right? And this is going to create the repetition creates a sense of pattern. Pattern creates a sense of rhythm. And in fact, we can even, imagine if we were hearing this sound would be roughly, right? So that you hear that clap, and then there is a sense of silence. On my screen, I have a rather large screen. It's about, I don't know, a couple centimeters or so. So I think that we could make even a sort of parallel here of thinking about the note as a mark, and that pause or quiet in the musical notation as negative space, right? Or maybe visual silence. So we're really looking at this combination of maybe seed mark and silence, right? Or seed mark and negative space, even as we read this notation. But I think it's really important to think about the impact, right, that repetition can have on our brain. And so we want to also look at the kind of rhythm, right, that will be established in the way that the brain responds to pattern. The brain, right, makes sense of our natural surroundings by looking for pattern. And so when it sees something that it immediately kind of sort of that feels consistent, it will basically expect, right, and almost project a reality, right, based on that expectation of those simple marks continuing as they do. So if you look at the second line in this music notation, we have something where there's a greater density of mark or note. I don't know, I probably need some work on my drumming, but the idea here is there's greater information per couple of centimeters per frame, for instance. And so the brain will also group that in a different way, right, in increasing complexity. These kinds of observations, I think, are really, really important when we start to look at our sort of brain response, our cortical response, if you will, to the visual fields we're looking at today. I also wanted to bring up this particular notation of music, this musical composition, because it's actually musical notations for shamanic drumming. And the reason I want to make this parallel here is because in shamanic drumming, the kind of consistent rhythmic pattern produces a very particular effect in the brain. In fact, at 5 to 7 beats per second, drumming will induce theta waves in the brain, producing an altered state of consciousness, which is marked by deep rest, slowed heart rate. Often it actually can induce a sort of quality of healing, something that's in or out of alignment in the body. Or if the beat is slightly changed, it can really increase at least sort of excited brain activity and produce a often really unparalleled set of visual and felt experiences. So when we look at, for instance, this drawing back again, I think it's interesting to think about how we might, one, hear this work or read it as a sort of musical notation. But also just kind of think about pattern and the rupture of the pattern and how our brain responds to it. So here you have, again, I'm going to go back to this sort of the basic mark here. I'm about 2/3 of the way from the left-hand side of the drawing. And we have this column of simple triangular marks. And I would say that we could say that this becomes a sort of seed mark, as I said earlier, for the drawing. Almost an effortless, I love that, right? Just sort of imagining a really, really simple triangle. And notice, for instance, how easy it is just to follow, either to follow from right to left horizontally, or even just to follow the column. Our brain is looking for that pattern to follow, right? I often say we are lemmings, right? When you give us a line, which he is basically doing, we will follow it. So then, however, as we reach the bottom of this column, we start to see a big, not a big, but a subtle shift, right? In the kind of spacing of the 3 tips of the triangle. So the triangle is starting to stretch out. As we continue to look throughout the work, more at your own pace, we see the triangles being flanked by this really jet black ink. We see the triangles sort of open up, break apart. We see them change direction. We see them stretch. And that effect of breaking the pattern is that our brain is going to take in that information differently. The variation is a cue to the brain to pay greater attention, right? In a lot of ways, to show us the error of the assumption, right, in the pattern making, and thereby inspire us to kind of expand, right? To pay attention, expand, create a broader container, if you will, for the variation that we see happening here. So in a lot of ways, right, variation is going to prompt us to expand, right, and sort of expect a different reality given this change. One thing I find really interesting about this drawing is this area here in the sort of mid-lower left, where the triangles somehow along just a slight diagonal really start to give the effect of dimension and depth. Our brains are constantly looking for things that are familiar. And this, of course, is how we have evolved and survived. But I think it's really interesting that we take these same rules and expectations to the drawing realm, right, or the installation realm. And so that we're kind of looking for things that are familiar, looking for things that are going to help us make sense, or even construct a reality given the rules that are in front of us. So Henri Michaud states in his book, Proust Was a Neuroscientist, our visual cortex is stimulated by angled lines. Neurons prefer high contrast edges over curves. And when we look at Ruth Asawa's work, of course, this is all high contrast, edges over curves, but also to really think about the brain in its very basic state of taking in information, taking in angled lines, even as we walk down, a city street, really looking for those shadows, those contrasts, and trying to make sense of that basic visual stimuli. So we're going to be looking at artwork that really kind of stays in that realm of high contrast, edges over curves, angled lines, etc. And I want to know, right, what is ultimately the effect for these artists to like play and explore that abstract visual realm. And as my last question on the page reflects, what is the effect of an accumulation of angled lines, of thousands of these seed marks in a given work? So I propose that these works, because they stay in the realm of angles, lines, contrast, shape, and shadow, and remain abstract, create a field for a perceptual experience, a perceptual shift in the mind of the viewer. And this seed mark and its variation are the key to this perceptual shift. And I just want to say, and like, why is this important, right? Well, I think if we really think about what artists are doing, why they do it, and who they are in the world, this parallel again to someone who creates a purposeful experience that will allow us to reflect on ourselves in new ways and bring new patterns, new paradigms into our society is very important right now, right? And very, very needed. So we are invited to bring our own interpretation to make sense of angles and lines that never cross into that realm of representation or the known world. We are invited to make meaning. So a few more questions. What is the effect of this overall threshold that the artists are making from these thousands of seed marks? And do you, as a viewer, when we're looking at these, albeit digital representations of their work, do you, as a viewer, experience the work as something that reaches out to you, sort of moving into your somehow, I don't know, personal, visual, cortical space? Or is it something that is pulling you in like a centrifugal force? And a third option, do they create a liminal space and in between? Now, one of the things I also want you to see in this image is the way that both of these artists, Asawa on the left, excuse me, Agnes on the right, are working at a very large scale. And I think this is another really key component. All of these artists tend to make work that is literally 5 to 6 feet in height and length. And I think this is a really important element in their work and affects the results that we experience. And that is that as human bodies, right, when we go to the work, we are engulfed by that size, right? It meets us in a very particular way. Several of the artists, notably Houshiary and Alma Thomas also, and even Agnes Martin, really think about windows, right? And a window size. So not only do they sort of meet the body in that way, but they also become sort of boundaries, right? To looking and how the body sort of experiences the outside world. But also, if you were to go up close to the work, like Agnes Martin is on the right, in fact, the peripheral vision would be completely covered by this field of visual stimuli. And I think that's also an important component of how the work becomes an agent in a perceptual shift. Okay, so before we go into some, well, rather short deep dives of these different artists and their seed marks, I wanted to honor Gordon Onslow Ford, the founder, along with Fariba, of the Lucid Art Foundation, and a inner traveler and outer wanderer who definitely discovered his own seed marks, the line circle dot that we see right here. And I think really inspired so many of us in our virtual room today to think about perception and the artist's role in playing with that. So let's begin. This is Alma Thomas. I wanted to just point out her birth date. She was born in Georgia in 1891, only a few decades after the abolishment of slavery, but really coming of age in a highly segregated and racialized nation, the United States. So here is Thomas at work in 1968. This is when she's really starting to devote her full energy to her work. I wanted to point this out, and I've tried to show you as many images of these artists in their home studios, which I find really exciting and inspiring. But 3 things to point out here. One, notice the large canvas behind her. This is before she kind of develops her, what people call her mature sort of artistic voice in the last few decades of her life. But notice the size, right? Again, that window size, quite large, so that the body would be ensconced, right, as it steps near it. Also notice that she is working at a table and the work is being made flat. So often Thomas would work flat on the ground, or not on the ground, on a table, and then would put up her work in a sort of different perspective as it went on the wall. And thirdly, her outfit. Thomas was the daughter of a dressmaker and also intellectuals who moved their kids to Washington, D.C. So that they could get better educational opportunities as a Black family in the early 1900s. But her love and I think sensitivity to textiles really will figure as an important part, especially in her master's degree. She focuses her teaching degree from Columbia University on puppetry as an agent of social change and participation, but using those textiles is an important part of that element. And here also, her particular outfit, which she is seen in quite a bit, and also even in other outfits, always tended to have a pattern to it. So I like to imagine her actually putting on these patterns that she will so intimately use and understand. There are so many thresholds and I would say glass ceilings, right, that many of these artists have crossed. I'm just going to go through a couple of them very, very briefly. So much more to say for another Saturday morning. So in 1924, Thomas became the first person ever to receive a fine arts degree from Howard University in art. And you can see her interests included painting, ceramics, and also costume design. Also, Thomas taught in the middle school, Shaw Junior High School, for 35 plus years. And I really want to honor how much energy and just energy must have gone into that endeavor. And there's a very touching anecdote that I came across that said, and you can see the quote here, that almost every other Black Washingtonian had missed Thomas for art. So her influence was vast, right? And often as educators, we may not even know how vast that influence was. But I love imagining her years and years at Shaw Junior High School during some very, very rocky times for this nation and for Washington, D.C., and for particularly Black children growing up in the U.S. So third point, earns a master's degree at the Teachers College. I mentioned that. Also was one of the co-founders of Barnett Aiden Gallery, one of the first Black-owned private galleries in the nation. So she retires, and only 6 years later, she becomes the first Black woman to be granted a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum. And in 2015, becomes the first Black woman to have her work in the collection of the White House. So this is actually a rare piece for her. She did not actually, she was not super inclined, right, to realist work. And I bring this work here because one, just thinking about the tensions of her local area, the tensions as an artist, as a Black woman. She really identified as one of the members of the Washington Color School, which included Sam Gillian and Morris Louis, but also did occasionally these sort of realist works, especially in her earlier years. Here you can see her interest in color, and even as she constructs the human form, right? The human form is dissolving, and she's really punctuating the crowd as these heads, right? Which again become almost like a seed mark that you'll see in just a few minutes. So one of the things I'm going to track for you today is also what these artists were inspired by. This is Thomas's house in Washington, D.C. And in 1964, she was already in, her late 60s, and she was bedridden with a sort of crippling arthritis. And she had been bedridden for quite a few days already. And she was looking through the window at the light coming through the trees. And in that particular state, experience something profound. The, the direction, ultimately, the sort of source of inspiration that would then lead her for her next decade or so of her great work. She says, "My earth paintings are solely inspired by nature. The display of the design formed by the leaves of the holly tree that covers the bay window in my home greets me each morning. These compositions are framed by the window panes with the aid of the wind as an active designer. The rays of the sunshine flickering through the leaves add joy to their display." Now, I think this is such a sort of, humble picture, but I think it's really endlessly inspiring to imagine that we can find our greatest inspirations, right? Our greatest work, perhaps like Alma Thomas's, lay just outside, right? And really in her sort of moment of understanding that all of this was right there for her to explore. I also want to point out that one of the key characteristics of shamans in traditional societies are that they experience some sort of health crisis, or sort of, I don't know, abrupt sort of psychic break, right? That sort of explores or shows them a glimpse of the non-ordinary world. And I will say that this seems like kind of one of those punctuating moments for Thomas when she realizes the direction that her work will take her. So let's get into her work. This forms the sort of most widely acclaimed work in her career, her late, the work that she did in her 70s and 80s. And let's take a look at this in terms of the seed mark. You can see, right, that there are a number of repeated motions. We talked about the sort of dab of the brush. Thomas liked to use highly saturated colors and chose acrylic for its fast drying qualities to do that as she was working in her home. Here we have also a close-up of the dashes. And you can see, in fact, that there are these striations. Let's go back and just take a look, where there are some areas like in the lower left where the striations are sort of all like a vertical line is quite vertical, right? Almost like extremely linear. And then there are other areas where that kind of order or tightness really falls apart. If you almost, I can see it better almost if I squint at this image, I start to see stripes also going down the page. And this was actually something that Alma really termed herself. She called them Alma stripes. And they were a collection of stripes vertical that would go completely down the canvas. And how she made these was actually to create, she had a large elastic band, and she would hang or kind of fit the elastic band over the large canvas, using that elastic as a guide, and then make the marks as she moved down the line. The image on the left shows, in fact, a little bit of a pencil line, really pointing to her kind of premeditation and planning that went into a lot of her work. They look rather spontaneous to my mind, but in fact, they were really quite carefully planned. And then the image on the right shows that not only was she interested in the additive process, right, of adding color and thinking about color responses, etc., but also really making sure that the negative space, sometimes just as the sort of pre-primed canvas, but other times that the negative space, as you can see here, was augmented by later strokes, right? So really, I think paying great attention to this level of variation and consistency. Here's an example of some of her planning that went into creating the Alma stripes. Humans' highest inspirations come from nature. Color is life. Light is the mother of color. Light reveals to us the spirit and living soul of the world through colors. Through color, I have sought to concentrate on beauty and happiness rather than on man's inhumanity to man. So here we see very brightly colored work. Her ideas of color theory were something that they often discussed within her loose friendships with the group of the Washington Color School. But also she was heavily influenced by Kandinsky and Johann Itten, who then, of course, from the Bauhaus also influenced Joseph Albers. So very powerful work, right? And again, an interesting question to like, does the work pull you in? Does the work kind of come out? Color work, right, was important to her, and you can see that color and light are sort of her guiding principles. However, I do want to say that this work, made in 1968, is made against the backdrop of the riots, difficult 2 years during the sort of peak of the civil rights movement, anti-Black protests, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And she was really quite close to all of this intense action. And at the same time, here are the pansies blooming in Washington, right? Or the azaleas or the hydrangeas. So I think one, this really points to the sort of why she went to the work, why she made the work she did. But also, I think it brings up some really interesting questions. When kind of asked to identify, right, as a Black American or a female painter, she would say, I am a painter. I'm an American. And so those assertions, I think, really moved her beyond the tendency at the time to pigeonhole and limit people who identified, right, as a certain gender or as African American. And it's also interesting to realize that perhaps she couldn't claim those, right, in an environment that would certainly penalize her if she was interested in really reaching broader audiences and creating those perceptual shifts of meaning. So this work is called Blast Off. This is part of her space series. And very, very quickly, I just wanted to show you the way that she constructs this is actually this tiny little metal dot here at the very top is actually the spacecraft as it takes off for the moon. The flight to the moon and the experiments and excitement around Mars was a very uplifting moment during all of these really difficult times here on Earth. Excuse me. And I enjoy reading this one particularly because this is the sort of rocket, right? But the fiery triangle behind it is in fact the flames coming off of the rocket ship as it moves across the Earth. So this is an aerial perspective, and the striations below are actually the sort of landscape that we see of the Earth's surface. So another interesting and possible reading of her bright colors is that Thomas may have been interested in developing color as a sort of metaphor for a harmonious and multiracial society that she hoped would come about, and that certainly may have been inspired by the space age. More needs to be explored on that. So I'm just going to wander through a couple last works of hers. Notice the seed mark and the way here there's very little background. And towards these later paintings, the way that you've seen the striations now move away, the Alma stripes have dissolved into really, I think, a playful, much larger lexicon, if you will, of mark making, almost grammatical structures here. And then one of her final works, a massive 13-foot canvas. Here as a triptych, you'll notice that the canvases almost take the place of her original sort of ordered stripes. But within that, you see a great deal of movement and maybe even sort of lyrical curves, giving way ultimately to more and more negative space on the far right. Do you see that painting? She said, look at it move. That's energy, and I'm the one who put it there. I transform energy with these old limbs of mine. Now we're going to take a look at Ruth Asawa. And this is an amazing picture. One, I guess it really shows again sort of her process, but also this is her quote, right, from 1947 as she's on the eve of marrying Lanier, an architect from Black Mountain, and a marriage that neither of their parents approved of as it was interracial at the time. But she says, from now on, only bleeding fingers from wire are tolerable pains. And she, in this letter, makes a commitment to her work, to her future as an artist, and really, I think, like Thomas, decides that her work is not going to be sort of in service of the pain and the limitations that she's experienced as a Japanese American in this country, but rather going to put to a different use. So she declares herself a citizen of the world, and will continue to transcend the pain of racism and kind of inflicted upon her over and over. She says about wire, I want to take wire and give it a new definition. It's the distance between effort and effect. I love that. The distance between effort and effect. I am curious to know where it will take me, and it may be something very different from anything you ever imagined. So here we have another very playful investigation of the seed mark. Sometimes it's a triangle. Sometimes for Asawa, it's this curve, and we saw those in the carved doors many, many years later. One thing that I found really beautiful in this more recent research is that apparently that when she was young and her parents were Japanese immigrants and working on a farm, she would drag her toes in the sand on the back of a trailer, and she would make these interlocking forms just like this. Later, of course, this will become a seminal element of her work. So Ruth Asawa is, as a Japanese American, interned for several years in 2 different camps. And this is a memorial that she was asked to do for San Jose, and was, really crafted from her own memories of that difficult time. One thing that I think is interesting is to really think about the prominence of wire and the way that the barbed wire literally held and bound and took away her family's livelihood and their possessions. And then the way that she is able to transform such a very powerful and intense yet industrial material into something so elegant and diaphanous. So she learns how to crochet when she's in Toluca, Mexico. She learns how to sort of weave from the teacher she's helping there, and comes home to Black Mountain College, where she's landed in wonderful stories of bravery and people helping her in really amazing ways. But she ends up really sort of exploring how to take industrial, sort of more modern materials and the more modernist thinking that's happening around the Bauhaus, and using a traditional craft and technique of the craft to create these full-scale, body-sized wire installations, which she always thought of as drawings in space. Here we see in the close-up the way that her seed mark is actually the looped wire. And she would talk about making 5 sort of loops and then starting again. So the seed becomes a sort of seed packet, right? Or a grouping of greater complexity. And then that complexity is going to give rise to these very complex forms. Often the inside of a form would become the outside of a form, much like a donut or a tori. These are sophisticated scientific models, and really explore, right, and create these evolving spaces that are both moving and still interior and exterior. And here you can see the variation that resulted from this. She says, my curiosity was aroused by the idea of giving structural form to the images in my drawings. So the drawings come first, then the structural forms. These forms come from observing plants, the spiral shell of a snail, seeing light through insect wings, watching spiders repair their webs in the early morning, and seeing the sun through the droplets of water suspended from the tips of pine needles while watering my garden. And I'm reminded of the Torana in Buddhist stupas, such as the one at Sanchi here, almost creating gateways. For this form, Ruth Asawa couldn't figure out actually how to draw it. She eventually learns how to, but she had to sculpt it first, right? So I think there's an interesting element there around process and knowing, and sort of trying to find and make sense of even forms in these different ways of pattern making, either by drawing or by sculpting. That art really becomes a method of knowledge, right? Or sort of knowledge seeking. Finally, Ruth Asawa greatly inspires me. She had 6 kids and often worked with them hanging around. And in addition to being this amazing thinker and artist, she also contributed greatly to the San Francisco art scene in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Okay, I'm going to be honest. I felt like I had to put in Agnes Martin, and I just basically want to share some of the highlights that I've discovered in this research project. So the reason I felt like she needed to be included in here, because she's a sort of quintessential, well, one, she's she's the most well-known and white artist that we have presented here today. But she's also so well known for her lack of representation, for her commitment to the grid and abstraction. And what I've come to understand is that she wasn't so interested in the sense of the grid or structure. In fact, she says, I've been doing those grids for years, but I never thought of them as structure. Structure is not the process of composition. Why even musical compositions, which are very formally structured, are not about structure, because the musical composer listens all the time. He doesn't think about structure. So you must say that my work is not about structure. So my question then is, what is she listening to? What is she making? And to use the musical metaphor, what do we hear when we look at Martin's work? I think what's really notable here, like Ruth Asawa, right, the pencil lines, which she was really consistent in using, become a sort of, like Ruth Asawa's wire, a boundary, right, to encapsulate space. So really, her seed mark, right, is one that is really more about space, maybe even about crafting space, suggesting space, than dabbing, right, or the additive process that we saw Thomas using. One thing that's also really interesting is in this sort of level of the monochrome, right, that the pencil marks its wobbliness, its straightness, the way it shines in the light, the way it becomes almost sort of so human and therefore intimate, right? Really, all of those details become much more interesting and important to us in this field of such a quiet pattern. Agnes Martin actually saw her inspirations as tiny postage stamp size finished paintings, and then would spend months completing the work and really experiencing the work and trying to like keep that feeling alive as she labored over the work. So this should be tiny on your screen, and that's on purpose. This piece is called The Tree, and it's a seminal work for her. She says that she was thinking about the innocence of a tree. Note the reference again to nature. And suddenly this image appeared. And she said, it felt right. It felt right. I'm reminded, I think that often artists actually have ideas or feelings floating around in their head, and they sometimes are lucky to find embodiments like she did for this one. One thing that's also interesting is to think about her early sculptural work. And in understanding this work, I've been starting to think about, and she mentions sort of a reference to that these lines are points in space, almost as if that sort of sculptural work suggests that. And so in fact, we are looking at intersections of like almost spatial coordinates. Noticing the variation here. And really, really inspired by the horizontal line, the plane, the second paragraph. It was just like a straight line. It was a horizontal line. And I thought that there wasn't a line that affected me like a horizontal line. And so she continues on this vent over and over. And the highlight here is to really think about her emphasis on beauty and especially joy as something that she was always seeking not only to have when she was making her work, but also to create. Especially, I think this is notable in sort of contrast to also the fact that she suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. So also really against really, really difficult struggles with that. Okay, the next artist is Nene Okore. I'm gonna just talk for another little bit. I have two more artists briefly to share with you. So this is Nene Okore. She was born in Australia, but she is Nigerian, and she is right now working as a contemporary artist in Chicago. So also an educator, inventor, and activist. And this is her work. This is called Butterfly. She thinks about the word butterfly as a metaphor for the free-flowing, unbounded entity for energy and flow. She's inspired by weaving, dyeing, sewing, rolling, twisting, and recycling of the materials, the sort of humble materials that she saw the women in her town in Nigeria working, sitting on the mats. And labor and also the physical experimentation of materials in her hands is really what directs her work. So here we see a detail of her seed mark, a piece of clay that she actually, she brought a bunch of clay with her friends, with her kids one day, and they started making these rolls. And this inspired all of this ceramic work. So the seed mark is three-dimensional, and you can see by its variation, no one is exactly the same. And by its insertion into this burlap grid, the burlap grid becomes sort of morphed, distorted, and three-dimensional. Okore was actually absolutely in love with the earth and talks, in fact, about how she just loved the rich smell of dirt and almost wanted to eat it, often in her childhood. And I love that, like that sort of image, and imagining her taking clay and all the other materials that she will use in her work as this sort of devotional activity. This is called osimili, the Igbo word in Nigeria for a huge body of water, but alluding to the fluidity and energy, vulnerability, and life. And making sort of references to roots, veins, and plants, becoming really like a microcosm or a life force. This image really reminds me of one of my favorite images of all time. This is a picture of the Nigerian royalty, so the Yoruba royalty, wearing veils of cowrie shells. And they're wearing them because it was thought that they were, as royalty, too sacred to be looked upon directly in the eye. So in essence, they are wearing the threshold between the ordinary and the non-ordinary. And I feel like Okore's work really embodies that idea. This is called Nlecha. and refers to the complex ritual around fabric in Nigerian society, and how women of different classes parade and flaunt that. But also, and she was very inspired by women who are less wealthy, who make do with the materials that are available. That making do has prompted her to explore lots of different materials in her work, including rope, burlap, found materials, found newspapers, and even creating something called bioplastic, which she is now making installations of. It's interesting to note the large scale and how this really almost makes the human body, right, a seed mark in concert with the work. Okay, the last artist, Shirazeh Houshiary, born in Iran in 1957, leaves Iran to study in England in 1974, and really doesn't return back and makes England her home after the revolution. So this work, called Fine Frenzy, she talks about reading Lacan, and when she goes to the mirror, sort of in response to sort of, who are you, this question that he asks, she looks in the mirror, and the closer she gets to the surface of the mirror, she sees less and less of herself, but she sees the breath as evaporation, right? As sort of fog on the mirror. And then as she pulls away, she watches that evaporate. And that moment for her became this profound inspiration, a moment where she started to understand and glimpse the dissolving nature of the self, her perception around the self, and really then guides her work. So this is a repetitive process where she takes a dark canvas, black canvas made from acrylic, and then takes a white pencil and over and over and over again repeats the phrase, I am not, in Arabic, to create this crescendo, this emanation and evocation of breath. Houshiary is the last artist today because she's so extremely lucid and verbal about what she is doing. This is called Iota. I set out to capture my breath, she says. Breath as a seed to her is also the seed to her process and the key to life. And we can look at breath, right, as the essential human pattern and rhythm. The detail. This large work called Motet, actually I want to just pay attention to the field, the overall sort of shifts in color, and then these scratches that you see, this sort of linear forms. She talks about her process as actually pouring acrylic paint onto the surface of a canvas on the floor, and over months and months, over time, really allowing the water to create a sort of evocation of chaos and the natural flow. And then it's her process to come into the work after with pencil and make these human marks over and over and over again. It is an intense labor. And she finds actually that it's where and how the human mark interacts with these patterns made by the water that is the real work. Kind of experiencing over and over again the affirmation of the I and the dissolution of the I over and over again. And even formally, artistically, really trying to figure out where the self, the order, the human mind meets the natural flow and rhythm. There is no basic stuff of the universe. Phenomena are ephemeral and are mere rising waves in the stream of existence. So physical reality is insubstantial and ultimately composed of sets of fields. It is this repetition that seems to provide the threads for it. To create webs and networks is to connect everything, both living and non-living. So when we see lines in her work, the really is kind of like deep, not the tiny little lines, but these kind of fissures. Those are the moments, she says, are the hardest at connecting the human hand to that evocative flow and sort of stream of life. So as we conclude, I repeat again Houshiary's comment here. I found repetition is the law of the cosmos. Looking at all of these different works, we see that the artists build first with a particular seed mark, and then create an architecture of transformation, encoding in the repetition the various forms of rhythm and silence, consistency and variation. Returning, one, looking at the seed mark, really creating that threshold of accumulation and moving that seed mark into a growing cluster of emerging relational complexity, systems of rhythm and rupture. These unique constructions of positive and negative space inspire the viewer to participate and pay attention. Two, we've seen that these artists use light, soil, plants, water, and breath as key elements. Three, they all seem to hover in the space of the in-between, resolving where contradictions and formal paradoxes dissolve into greater meaning. Four, all make large body-sized works whose completion represent hours of physical labor and intense discipline. We could look at their even work, right? Their work of repeated actions and seed acts as also a rhythmic notation through sustained time as they make the work, scrawling, dragging, pounding the clay. And these works as offerings all seek to give the viewer and maker a positive experience of joy, hope, and vitality. Five, the community, activists, mothers, educators, writers, all have had also some sort of life-changing moments or flashes of insight. And six, setting out to capture my breath, to find the essence of my own existence, transcending name, nationality, and cultures. This is a work by Houshiary and Pip Horn. And literally, right, we are witnessing the grid of a typical window being warped, right? Warped as a sort of perceptual shift occurs. We are being asked to witness the physical sort of emanation and opening that can happen when we have to expand, right, our sense of reality and take in new information. So, quote, this liminal stage, the being of threshold spaces, is ambiguous and a state of pure possibilities where the realms of conscious and unconscious and different ends of the spectrum find their place. When we go to the work of these artists, we stand at the doors, the thresholds that they have created, doorways made from bleeding fingers, sore muscles, intense concentration, and blinding vision. We go to have an experience of our humanity. We go to be connected, to be invited to explore our limits and possibilities, our chaos and our order, our perceptions and our longings. We go to these shamans' doorsteps to explore new patterns of meaning making, to join our own voices to theirs, and to create new paradigms for artists in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennie. Thank you. As I mentioned, last quarter, we were looking at the overarching, and this was an incredible example of how you took 5 artists and you went inside their process and took us inside of their process really in detail. And that was just incredible to just watch their processes. By the way, you were okay? You were fine with the accent of Houshiary. That's how
Thank you.
Persian. And is more likely that it was Persian writing or Farsi than Arabic. I would like to open this up for maybe a 15 minutes Q&A, but I just wanted to comment about the way you create, you made this a theme and brought that pattern, the pattern of seed, inspiration of nature, union of opposite, and the goal and the community and social action. And this is really brings a lot about what women artists do. We had a group of artists, which you were part of them, We call ourselves 9 Women, 10,000 Things. It was one of the seminars at the Lucid Art Foundation in 2003, and some of the attendees were part of that. And we kept exploring about this idea of being a woman and being an artist. And we decided to have a potluck, and everybody made this beautiful food. And then as we start talking, and we realized it's not just about art making, it was more for women in its life is art. So I am just very excited about this in-depth view of 5 amazing